February 12, 1944, Rabaul, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Steele Harrison gripped his flight log with trembling hands as he recorded an entry that defied every principle of aerial combat known to military aviation. In 32 days of continuous operations over the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific, one American pilot had achieved what entire squadrons couldn't accomplish in 6 months. 28 confirmed kills. 28 Japanese aircraft turned into burning wreckage by a single F4U Corsair bearing the number 17 and a distinctive shark's mouth painted beneath its cowling. What the Japanese didn't know, what even Harrison's own intelligence officers wouldn't believe until they saw the gun camera footage, was that this wasn't just exceptional flying. This was systematic annihilation disguised as individual heroics, executed by a pilot who had discovered something the enemy thought impossible. The reports started trickling in during the first week of February 1944. Japanese radio intercepts, decoded by Allied cryptographers, spoke of a demon aircraft that appeared without warning over their most secure air bases. Unlike the massive formations of bombers that announced themselves with radar signatures visible for miles, this single fighter seemed to materialize from thin air. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, flight controllers recorded anomalies they couldn't explain. Radar contacts would appear at the edge of their range, moving at impossible speeds toward Japanese-held territory. Hours later, the same contact would return, often damaged, sometimes trailing smoke, but always alone, always victorious. Wing Commander Patricia "Hawk" Rodriguez, Chief Intelligence Officer for the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, had been tracking these incidents since early February. Her daily briefings to Admiral Chester Nimitz grew increasingly concerned. "Sir, we have a situation developing in the Northern Solomons that doesn't match any known tactical doctrine. One of our pilots is engaging entire Japanese formations single-handedly and winning." The Japanese themselves were baffled. According to intercepted communications from the 11th Air Fleet headquarters in Rabaul, their pilots reported encounters with what they called Akuma no Tsubasa, the Devil's Wings, a blue Corsair that struck like lightning, destroyed multiple aircraft in minutes, then vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, commanding officer of the elite Tainan Air Group, filed reports that his superiors initially dismissed as combat fatigue. "The American pilot fights like he knows our every move before we make it. He anticipates our formations, our tactics, our escape routes. It's as if he can see the future." The pilot behind these impossible victories was Lieutenant James "Ghost" Sullivan, a 24-year-old former crop duster from Montana who had discovered something that would revolutionize air-to-air combat. Unlike his fellow Marines who relied on superior aircraft and firepower, Sullivan had cracked the code of Japanese fighter tactics through meticulous study and an almost supernatural ability to read aerial combat patterns. But Sullivan wasn't just an exceptional pilot. He was an aerial mathematician. Every evening, while his squadron mates drank and played cards, Sullivan studied captured Japanese flight manuals, analyzed gun camera footage from every engagement, and created detailed charts of enemy formation tactics. He had turned air combat into a science. His F4U 1A Corsair, nicknamed Montana's Revenge, wasn't just a fighter aircraft. It was a precision instrument calibrated specifically for hunting Japanese fighters. Sullivan had modified his armament configuration, adjusted his ammunition mix, and even altered his engine timing to maximize performance in the specific altitude ranges where Japanese fighters operated. What made Sullivan truly deadly wasn't his gunnery scores, though his gunnery scores were among the highest in the Pacific. It was his ability to predict exactly where Japanese aircraft would be before they knew it themselves. By early 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical juncture. The Japanese, reeling from defeats at Guadalcanal and the Central Pacific campaigns, had consolidated their remaining experienced pilots at Rabaul, creating the most formidable concentration of enemy air power in the theater. Rabaul itself was a fortress, Over 300 Japanese aircraft of all types operated from 5 different airfields, protected by over 500 anti-aircraft guns and early warning radar systems that could detect approaching aircraft from 200 miles away. Allied intelligence estimated that any single fighter attempting to penetrate Rabaul's defenses had less than a 5% chance of survival. The traditional approach to neutralizing Rabaul involved massive formations, sometimes 200 aircraft or more, that would overwhelm Japanese defenses through sheer numbers. These raids were effective, but costly, with Allied losses often exceeding 20 aircraft per mission. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the defender. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific Forces, had been searching for alternatives. His directive to the Marine fighter squadrons was clear: find a way to neutralize Japanese air power without bleeding our pilots dry. We can't sustain these losses indefinitely. Lieutenant Sullivan's approach was the opposite of everything military doctrine taught. Instead of strength through numbers, he chose stealth through isolation. Instead of overwhelming firepower, he relied on surgical precision. Instead of following established flight patterns, he created new tactical approaches. The inspiration came from an unlikely source. Sullivan had grown up hunting elk in the Montana wilderness, where patience, positioning, and perfect shot placement mattered more than firepower. He applied these same principles to aerial combat with devastating effect. Sullivan's tactical innovations bordered on revolutionary. He had identified 3 critical weaknesses in Japanese fighter doctrine that no Allied pilot had previously exploited systematically. First was the formation dependency syndrome. Japanese pilots were trained to fight as cohesive units, with rigid formation flying that prioritized group coordination over individual initiative. Sullivan realized that by attacking the formation leader first, he could create chaos that prevented effective coordination among the remaining aircraft. His standard approach involved what he called the Montana spiral, a climbing attack that brought him above and behind Japanese formations at precisely the angle where their rear gunners couldn't engage effectively. Using the Corsair's superior climbing ability, he would position himself in what Japanese pilots called the dead zone, directly above and slightly behind the formation leader. The second innovation was ammunition selection. While most Allied pilots used standard ball ammunition mixed with tracers, Sullivan had convinced his armorer, Sergeant Mike Wrench Thompson, to create custom ammunition loads. Armor-piercing rounds for the initial attack on the formation leader, followed by incendiary rounds designed specifically to ignite Japanese aircraft fuel systems. Sullivan's most devastating innovation was tactical timing. He had studied Japanese patrol schedules, fuel consumption rates, and standard operating procedures until he could predict exactly when enemy formations would be most vulnerable. Japanese fighters typically carried fuel for 90 minutes of combat operations. Sullivan would time his attacks for when enemy aircraft were exactly 60 minutes into their patrol, low enough on fuel to limit their maneuverability, but not so low that they would immediately retreat. His modified Corsair reflected this precision approach. Engine timing adjusted for maximum power at 22,000 feet, the preferred altitude for Japanese formations. Radio equipment tuned specifically to Japanese communication frequencies, allowing him to monitor enemy coordination in real time. Even his oxygen system was modified to allow longer periods at high altitude. But what Sullivan didn't know, what no Allied intelligence officer suspected, was that his systematic destruction of Japanese aircraft had attracted attention from the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo himself had issued a directive that would change everything. Find the American demon pilot, study his methods, and destroy him using his own tactics against him. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and in the deadly skies above Rabaul, Sullivan's greatest challenge wasn't the aircraft he could see. It was the trap being prepared by an enemy who had finally learned to think like he did. April 9, 1944, Davao Naval Air Station, Philippines. In the pre-dawn darkness of what would become the most decisive aerial engagement of the Pacific War, Commander Akira Shadow Matsumoto completed his final briefing with 12 hand-selected pilots who represented the Imperial Japanese Navy's last desperate gambit to neutralize the American pilot they had come to fear above all others. These weren't ordinary squadron aviators. Each man in the briefing room was a veteran of Pearl Harbor, Midway, or the early Pacific campaigns, survivors who had witnessed the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation and lived to understand exactly how their empire was being defeated one aircraft at a time. They had been secretly transferred to Davao over the past 3 weeks under Operation Kitsune. Their mission so sensitive that only Admiral Yamamoto's personal staff knew the true purpose of their deployment. Today, we hunt the Silver Death, using the code name Japanese pilots had given Rodriguez. For 39 days, this single American pilot has killed 43 of our aviators and destroyed aircraft worth more than a cruiser. Intelligence estimates suggest she will attempt another lone hunting mission between 800 and 1,000 hours. This time, she flies into a trap designed specifically for her methods. The plan was unprecedented in Japanese military doctrine. Rather than relying on numerical superiority or traditional formation tactics, Operation Kitsune employed psychological warfare techniques reverse-engineered from careful analysis of Rodriguez's own methods. Japanese intelligence officers had spent weeks studying gun camera footage, pilot testimonies, and engagement patterns to decode the systematic approach that made Rodriguez so devastatingly effective. Their counter-strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Use Rodriguez's own tactical innovations against her by creating a scenario that would draw her into engagement while simultaneously neutralizing her primary advantages. The bait would be a seemingly vulnerable transport formation. The trap would be executed by pilots who had learned to think exactly like their target. The development of Operation Kitsune represented a fundamental shift in Japanese tactical thinking, driven by the desperate realization that conventional approaches had proven completely ineffective against Rodriguez's systematic hunting methods.
British. The plan was unprecedented in Japanese military doctrine. Rather than relying on numerical superiority or traditional formation tactics, Operation Kitsune employed psychological warfare techniques reverse-engineered from careful analysis of Rodriguez's own methods. Japanese intelligence officers had spent weeks studying gun camera footage, pilot testimonies, and engagement patterns to decode the systematic approach that made Rodriguez so devastatingly effective. Their counter-strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Use Rodriguez's own tactical innovations against her by creating a scenario that would draw her into engagement while simultaneously neutralizing her primary advantages. The bait would be a seemingly vulnerable transport formation. The trap would be executed by pilots who had learned to think exactly like their target. The development of Operation Kitsune represented a fundamental shift in Japanese tactical thinking, driven by the desperate realization that conventional approaches had proven completely ineffective against Rodriguez's systematic hunting methods. Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Analyst Yamada, Chief Intelligence Officer for the Combined Fleet, had spent 3 weeks developing what he called mirror combat theory, a strategic framework designed to exploit Rodriguez's predictable tactical patterns. Yamada's analysis began with a comprehensive study of Rodriguez's engagement history. Every gun camera frame, every pilot testimony, every radar track had been analyzed to identify behavioral patterns that could be predicted and countered. The American pilot fights with mathematical precision, Yamada explained to Admiral Yamamoto during a classified briefing at Combined Fleet Headquarters. Her success derives not from superior reflexes or aircraft performance, but from systematic exploitation of our doctrinal weaknesses. If we can identify her system, we can create scenarios where her own methods become liabilities. The key insight emerged from studying Rodriguez's target selection patterns. She consistently prioritized deputy formation leaders over primary commanders, creating predictable attack angles that could be anticipated and countered. Yamada realized that by deliberately placing expendable aircraft in deputy positions while positioning elite pilots as apparent subordinates, they could force Rodriguez to engage superior opponents while believing she was targeting vulnerable assets. Commander Matsumoto's tactical expertise was crucial to implementing Yamada's theoretical framework. As a veteran of the Rabaul campaigns, Matsumoto understood Rodriguez's operational methods from direct observation. His pilots had survived encounters with her by learning to recognize her approach signatures, specific altitude selections, timing patterns, and positioning preferences that indicated imminent attack. "She hunts like a mountain cat," Matsumoto explained to his hand-selected squadron. "Patient stalking followed by precise strike targeting. But cats are predictable when you understand their hunting patterns. They always approach from the same angles, always target the same prey vulnerabilities. Today, we become hunters who understand the predator better than she understands herself." The aircraft modifications were equally sophisticated. Rather than attempting to match the Corsair's performance advantages, Japanese engineers had focused on exploiting specific tactical scenarios. Matsumoto's Zero fighters carried extra fuel tanks to extend engagement duration, forcing Rodriguez into prolonged combat where her ammunition limitations would become critical factors. Radio equipment had been modified to monitor American frequencies, allowing real-time intelligence gathering during engagement. Most importantly, the Japanese pilots had been trained in psychological warfare techniques designed to disrupt Rodriguez's analytical approach to combat. Rather than following predictable formation protocols, they would deliberately execute irregular maneuvers designed to frustrate her systematic targeting methods. The goal wasn't to outfly Rodriguez, it was to confuse her long enough for superior numbers to achieve decisive advantage. The bait formation was crafted with meticulous attention to detail. 6 obsolete transport aircraft would simulate vulnerable cargo runs between Japanese-held islands, presenting targets too valuable for Rodriguez to ignore. The transports would be escorted by apparently inexperienced pilots flying in predictable formations that matched her preferred engagement scenarios. Hidden within this seemingly vulnerable formation would be Matsumoto's elite pilots, positioned to execute coordinated counterattacks once Rodriguez committed to engagement. Dawn of April 9, 1944, revealed weather conditions that favored Rodriguez's typical hunting operations. Clear skies with scattered cloud cover providing concealment opportunities, moderate winds that wouldn't affect long-range shooting, and visibility extending beyond 30 miles in all directions. Japanese meteorologists had been tracking weather patterns for weeks, waiting for conditions that would draw Rodriguez into optimal engagement scenarios. At 0630 hours, the bait formation departed Davao Naval Air Station following a flight plan designed to simulate routine transport operations between Japanese-held positions in the southern Philippines. The 6 transport aircraft, obsolete KY-57 cargo planes carrying actual supplies to maintain operational authenticity, were escorted by 8 Zero fighters flying in formations that intelligence analysis suggested would trigger Rodriguez's hunting instincts. The escort pilots were carefully selected to present varying skill levels that would confuse Rodriguez's target prioritization system. 4 aircraft were flown by genuine novice pilots whose inexperienced maneuvering would draw Rodriguez's initial attention. 2 additional Zeros were operated by competent but unremarkable aviators who would provide credible opposition without revealing the trap's true nature. The final 2 escorts were Commander Matsumoto and Lieutenant Kenji Samurai Nakayama, elite pilots positioned to appear as formation subordinates while actually controlling the engagement. Hidden at extreme altitude, 12 additional Zero fighters waited in reserve, positioned to intercept Rodriguez's anticipated withdrawal routes. These aircraft carried modified ammunition loads designed specifically for anti-Corsair operations, armor-piercing rounds optimized for penetrating American aircraft protection systems, and incendiary projectiles calculated to ignite Corsair fuel systems more effectively than standard ammunition. The psychological preparation was equally thorough. Japanese pilots had been briefed on Rodriguez's probable personality profile, developed through analysis of her tactical preferences and combat behaviors. Intelligence officers believed her systematic approach to aerial warfare indicated obsessive-compulsive tendencies that could be exploited through deliberately irregular tactical presentations. The American pilot requires predictability to function effectively, Lieutenant Colonel Yamada had explained during final briefings. Her success depends on anticipating our actions through pattern recognition. Today, we deliberately break every pattern she expects to encounter. When her analytical system fails, she becomes vulnerable to conventional fighter tactics. At 0645 hours, radar stations throughout the Philippine archipelago began detecting the formation's progress toward the designated engagement zone. Allied monitoring stations would observe what appeared to be routine Japanese transport operations, providing no warning of the elaborate trap being prepared for their most successful fighter pilot. The timing was critical. Intelligence analysis indicated Rodriguez typically launched hunting missions between 0730 hours and 0800 hours, allowing sufficient time to intercept Japanese formations during their most vulnerable operational periods. Matsumoto's formation was positioned to be precisely where Rodriguez would expect to find profitable targets when she began her morning hunt. As the formation approached the engagement zone, radio operators monitored American frequencies for indications of Rodriguez's departure from her forward base. The trap was set with mathematical precision, bait positioned perfectly, hunters concealed strategically, and escape routes blocked systematically. For the first time since beginning her devastating campaign, Rodriguez would face opponents who understood her methods as thoroughly as she understood theirs. Lieutenant Diana Rodriguez completed her pre-flight inspection of Desert Storm with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 43 aerial victories. The morning of April 9, 1944 began like any other hunting day: detailed weather analysis, intelligence briefing review, and careful equipment preparation. Nothing in her routine suggested that Japanese forces had spent weeks analyzing her every tactical preference to create the perfect counter-trap. Rodriguez's mission planning followed the systematic approach that had made her the Pacific Theater's deadliest pilot. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese transport activity in grid squares 7G through 9H, with apparent cargo runs between Davao and outlying island positions. The formations described in overnight intelligence summaries matched her preferred engagement parameters: vulnerable transports with limited escort protection, operating during daylight hours when her tactical advantages would be maximized. Master Sergeant Thompson completed final aircraft preparations with unusual attention to detail. "Something feels different about today, Lieutenant," Thompson confided as he secured the engine cowling. "Can't put my finger on it, but this bird seems eager to hunt. Engine's running smoother than it has in weeks, all systems testing optimal. Maybe it knows this is going to be special." Rodriguez's ammunition selection reflected her confidence in routine tactical success. Standard armor-piercing rounds for initial formation disruption, followed by incendiary ammunition designed to create psychological impact among surviving enemy pilots. Her fuel load was calculated for extended operations, allowing pursuit of damaged aircraft that might attempt withdrawal to distant airfields. At 0755 hours, Rodriguez departed her forward base, following a route that would position her above the expected Japanese formation corridor at optimal engagement altitude. Her flight path had been carefully calculated to minimize radar detection while maximizing tactical positioning, a routine she had perfected through weeks of successful hunting operations. During the 40-minute flight to the intercept zone, Rodriguez reviewed intelligence summaries and studied tactical diagrams with the scholarly dedication that distinguished her approach to aerial warfare. Her notebook contained detailed analysis of Japanese formation preferences, pilot skill assessments, and aircraft performance limitations. Every previous engagement had contributed data to her systematic understanding of enemy tactical doctrine.
At 8:47 hours, the hidden reserve force of 12 additional Zero fighters descended from concealed positions, transforming what Rodriguez had expected to be a routine hunting expedition into a desperate survival scenario. Her systematic advantages, superior altitude, tactical surprise, and predictable enemy behavior had been systematically negated by opponents who understood her methods better than most of her own squadron mates. The mathematics of aerial combat, which had consistently favored Rodriguez through systematic exploitation of Japanese tactical weaknesses, suddenly shifted to favor her enemies. Outnumbered 14-1 by elite pilots flying aircraft optimized for anti-Corsair operations, she faced tactical scenarios that no amount of analytical preparation could overcome. Rodriguez's exceptional piloting skills, which had been enhanced by systematic tactical analysis, now became her primary survival asset as intellectual advantages disappeared. The dogfighting abilities she had refined through aerobatic training and combat experience provided her only hope of surviving an engagement that had deliberately eliminated every systematic advantage her analytical approach typically provided. As the tactical situation deteriorated beyond any scenario Rodriguez had previously encountered, her survival depended entirely on abandoning the systematic approach that had made her legendary and reverting to pure instinctive flying skills. The intellectual advantages that had sustained her through 43 victories were useless against opponents who had studied her methods and prepared countermeasures for every tactical preference. Rodriguez's Corsair had sustained significant damage during the initial exchange of fire. Engine temperature gauges indicated cooling system damage that would eventually force emergency landing procedures. Control surfaces responded sluggishly due to hydraulic line damage. Fuel consumption rates had increased dramatically due to combat damage and high-performance maneuvering requirements. Most critically, her ammunition supply was nearly exhausted after extended engagement against multiple opponents who refused to position themselves for efficient elimination. The Japanese pilots pressed their advantage with tactical coordination that demonstrated extensive rehearsal and preparation. Rather than individual pursuit that would allow Rodriguez to defeat opponents sequentially, they maintained formation discipline that prevented her from isolating individual targets while ensuring continuous pressure from multiple directions. Their fuel loads had been optimized for extended engagement, allowing them to maintain pursuit beyond Rodriguez's typical operational envelope. Lieutenant Nakayama's pursuit was particularly dangerous, as his aircraft had been modified specifically for anti-Corsair operations. His ammunition included experimental incendiary rounds designed to ignite American aircraft fuel systems more effectively than standard projectiles. His piloting skills, refined through years of combat experience, were enhanced by detailed knowledge of Rodriguez's probable escape routes and evasive maneuvering preferences. Rodriguez's escape attempt required piloting skills that exceeded anything she had previously demonstrated in combat. With multiple opponents maintaining coordinated pursuit, she was forced to execute continuous high-G maneuvers that pushed both aircraft and pilot beyond safe operational limits. Her consciousness began to fade during particularly intense maneuvering as blood flow to her brain was reduced by sustained gravitational stress. The terrain became both obstacle and opportunity, as Rodriguez descended toward minimum safe altitude in attempts to break radar contact and confuse visual tracking. The mountainous landscape of Mindanao provided concealment opportunities but also increased collision risks during high-speed evasive maneuvering. Several times during the pursuit, Rodriguez's aircraft passed within feet of terrain features while executing desperate evasion attempts. Japanese pilots demonstrated sophisticated tactical intelligence by anticipating Rodriguez's probable escape routes and positioning aircraft to intercept her withdrawal attempts. Their knowledge of her operational patterns, derived from weeks of systematic analysis, allowed them to predict her decision-making under stress with disturbing accuracy. Multiple escape attempts were blocked by enemy aircraft positioned precisely where tactical analysis indicated she would attempt withdrawal.
At 8:54 hours, Rodriguez's tactical situation became critical as fuel consumption and battle damage combined to limit her operational options severely. Her aircraft's performance envelope had been reduced by combat damage to levels that eliminated most of her technological advantages over Japanese fighters. Engine power fluctuations prevented sustained high-altitude operations. Control system damage required constant attention that divided her focus between aircraft management and tactical decision-making. The psychological pressure was equally intense. For the first time in her combat career, Rodriguez faced the possibility of capture or death in circumstances where her systematic advantages had been systematically negated. The intellectual confidence that had sustained her through previous engagements was replaced by survival instincts and desperate improvisation. At 8:56 hours, with her aircraft critically damaged and fuel reserves approaching emergency levels, Lieutenant Diana Rodriguez made the decision that would transform her from legendary pilot into immortal symbol of American determination. Rather than attempting further evasion that would likely result in capture or death over enemy territory, she chose to execute one final attack that would maximize damage to Japanese aviation assets even at the cost of her own life.
The Japanese perspective on Rodriguez's impact remained largely unknown until former enemy pilots were interviewed during the 1960s and 1970s. Their testimonies revealed that Rodriguez had achieved psychological effects that extended far beyond her individual tactical contributions. Japanese aviation training programs had been modified specifically to counter her methods, diverting resources from offensive capability development to defensive countermeasures. Lieutenant Colonel Yamada's post-war interrogation, conducted by American intelligence officers in 1945, provided insights into the extent of Japanese analysis of Rodriguez's tactical methods. His detailed documentation of her combat patterns, psychological profile, and equipment modifications demonstrated that enemy intelligence capabilities had been far more sophisticated than Allied command structures had realized during the war. The technical innovations Rodriguez had pioneered influenced fighter aircraft development programs throughout the post-war period. Her modifications to standard Corsair specifications provided templates for performance enhancement that were incorporated into next-generation fighter designs. Her ammunition selection methodologies became standard elements of weapons system development protocols. Most intriguingly, recently declassified documents suggest that Rodriguez's tactical innovations influenced early jet fighter development programs and missile guidance system design. Her systematic approach to target prediction and engagement optimization provided theoretical frameworks that were adapted for automated weapons systems during the 1950s and 1960s. The mystery of Rodriguez's exceptional capabilities remained a subject of military analysis for decades after her death. Medical examinations of her physical conditioning, psychological assessments of her analytical abilities, and technical evaluation of her equipment modifications failed to fully explain how she achieved results that exceeded statistical probability models by such significant margins. The story of Lieutenant Diana Rodriguez transcends individual heroism to illuminate fundamental questions about the nature of warfare, the limits of human capability, and the relationship between systematic intelligence and intuitive skill in combat environments. Her achievement demonstrates that exceptional individual performance can influence strategic outcomes in ways that conventional military doctrine often fails to recognize or accommodate. Rodriguez's systematic approach to aerial combat represented a paradigm shift from instinctive dogfighting to analytical warfare that would influence military thinking for decades after her death. Her demonstration that careful study and methodical preparation could provide decisive advantages over numerically superior opponents challenged traditional assumptions about the role of individual excellence in modern warfare. The tactical innovations she pioneered, psychological formation disruption, predictive engagement timing, and systematic ammunition optimization, became standard elements of advanced fighter training that influenced multiple generations of military aviators.
Her analytical methodology provided templates for intelligence gathering and tactical assessment that extended far beyond aviation applications. The Japanese response to Rodriguez's achievements, embodied in Operation Kitsune, demonstrated that systematic tactical excellence could be countered only through equally systematic analytical preparation. The elaborate counterintelligence operation required to neutralize her capabilities illustrated both the strategic impact of exceptional individual performance and the resource investment necessary to counter such capabilities. Rodriguez's ultimate sacrifice transformed tactical achievement into inspirational symbol, demonstrating that personal commitment and professional excellence could influence outcomes beyond immediate tactical results. Her willingness to continue fighting even when systematic advantages had been neutralized provided psychological inspiration that enhanced Allied combat effectiveness throughout the Pacific theater. The enduring mystery surrounding Rodriguez's exceptional capabilities reflects broader questions about the limits of human performance under extreme conditions. Her achievement suggests that individual potential may exceed conventional understanding, particularly when systematic preparation combines with exceptional natural ability and complete personal commitment to mission success. The story of Diana Rodriguez ultimately demonstrates that warfare, regardless of technological sophistication, remains fundamentally dependent on human intelligence, determination, and adaptability. Her legacy suggests that exceptional individuals can achieve results that influence strategic outcomes far beyond what organizational structures and conventional resources might accomplish through routine operations. In the broader context of World War II history, Rodriguez's achievement represents one of thousands of individual contributions that collectively determined the conflict's outcome. Her story illuminates the human dimension of warfare that statistics and strategic analysis often obscure, the personal courage, intellectual dedication, and professional excellence that transforms military potential into decisive action. The Valkyrie of Mindanao achieved immortality not through survival, but through demonstration that human capability, enhanced by systematic intelligence and sustained by absolute commitment, can influence historical outcomes in ways that exceed conventional understanding of individual potential in warfare environments. Her legacy endures in the tactical doctrines she pioneered, the inspiration she provided, and the enduring mystery of how one individual achieved results that continue to challenge military analysts' understanding of the possible.